Now, our title is Navigating Torah in the West in the Secular World, but the fact is that many of these issues are applicable to Eretz Yisrael as well, in the sense that if you're trying to create a society that's more pluralistic, i.e., if Israel is going to be a society that is not governed by halacha, then there's a question of how the halachic Jews will integrate into that society. And that becomes even more so of an issue because if halachic Jews become more and more involved politically and have a greater clout politically, like we're here, how many Jews are there in Canada and in the States? So it's obviously a vast majority of non-Jews or whatever, but in Israel, if you have a large percentage of halacha Jews and they're getting involved in the Knesset, and you have X percentage of Knesset members who are frum, how do they vote on issues, and how can they vote? Like I did a talk about Yair Lapid's recent talk to the Kiryat Dona College, and I did a shir on that. That's up on Kosher Tube as well. And I point out the fact is that what in Yair Lapid's discussion, he's saying you have to be involved, you have to be responsible. You know, you've won, you have responsibility. You are now part of the mainstream. We have to create a new mainstream that puts together all the different factions into a new Israeliness. And he's basically saying, in the same way you want us to respect you, you have to respect us. So the way I'm saying it is, let's say, what do you do with the women at the wall? In other words, you know, a lot of people who are frum don't recognize that there are conservative Reform Jews who truly believe in conservative Reform Judaism. I know that Reform Judaism put out an argument that they are the true descendants of the Pharisees, the Prushim of Chazal. That the Orthodox really are like the Sadducees, because from the Reform perspective, the Sadducees are the more traditionalists, and the Pharisees were the great innovators. So they say now it's the Orthodox who are in the tradition of the Sadducees, because they're so traditionalists, and we, the Reform, are saying they are the tradition of the Pharisees. So if you run into an individual like that who believes very strongly that women should be allowed to wear talis and tefillin at the wall, and it's wrong to say not, and so forth, there are aspects of Yair Lapid's talk that basically says, well, you Haredim, as you become more and more part of the mainstream of society, you have to also protect the other factions of the society. So a lot of the discussion we're discussing here in terms of navigating the secular society, how you deal with different groupings in a secular society, it's very much a similar discussion, a similar issue very much, and even perhaps more so in Eretz Yisrael, because you are dealing with different factions of what they want to create in terms of a Israeli Jewish society, and so forth. Anyway, so that's an underlying aspect of what I think are the themes that we're discussing here. So I want to get into some specific issues, but I think what I've really tried to do is define the various sort of vector forces that are involved in having to make a decision and basically it's a new phenomenon from a halachic perspective in very ways, and therefore it's a tough situation. Rabbi Broid mentioned to me once, I spoke in his shul in Atlanta, Michael Broid, right, and I spent Shabbos with him, and he mentioned to me something that I found very fascinating. He said he can pinpoint, because Rabbi Broid has a remarkable photographic memory. It's tremendous bekias. And he said he could pinpoint exactly when the 5 major poskim of America changed their perspective on the government. The five major poskim, was Ramosha, the Satmar Rav, the Rav Yosheber, I think Rav Henkin, and I don't remember the fifth, but he said he could pinpoint it, like he almost to the date, because he read Truvas from these individuals talking about how you relate to the secular government, okay, in terms of attitudes for secular government, and then you see that after a certain point in time, there's a completely different viewpoint, okay, in the sense that, like Ramosha would say, like someone supposedly asked Ramosha about some tax issue, and he said, "What are you talking about? This is a Medina Shel Chesed. How could you think of not paying your taxes?" Something of that nature. I mean, like a complete shift in the sense that, and if you look in halacha, you see the attitude towards the secular government was always, there's din shemachutz din, you have to find it, so forth and so forth, but basically you still recognize they're out to get you. Okay, and therefore the attitude is we want to be good citizens, but we don't want to be taken advantage of. So there's an attitude of some type in the halacha. There's an attitude of that tension. We protect, do what's right, but don't be taken advantage of, and that idea. But the fact is, because the taxes there would be oppressive taxes against Jews and so forth. But in America, that wasn't there. Government was just acting as a government, so it was a very different perspective. So you could tell pinpoints the point where the five major poskim of the 20th century changed their ideas. But if you think about that, that's within the last 100 years. All the other previous discussions of how we relate in a secular environment is all what you would call is an oppressive environment. In other words, the external society around us is not there to support us. We have to figure out how to survive given their pressure on us, and that pressure may be very, very powerful to get us to convert or whatever it is, or it might be like the classic Islam concept, where the people of the books, i.e., Jews and Christians, have to be somewhat treated as second, as with respect as second. Pardon? Dhimmi, right, as second-class citizens, but still they're not first-class citizens. So the point is a lot of the halachic formulation was to how to survive in this environment. The environment might be very oppressive, or it might be less oppressive, but it was obviously not fostering. We're now differing.
In America, it's more attractive.
More oppressive. It's yes. That's an issue with assimilation and so forth. But the fact is you have an environment that's saying we're not trying to make it. We're not trying to force you to become Christians. You want to be Jews? Fine. We'll let you be Jews within certain limits. Whatever the limits are in terms of and that's why it's a very different environment. And the two major forces of that environment are the forces that didn't just affect Jews; it affected the whole society, development of rights, and that was the force of freedom from and freedom of. And those are two very specific forces and vectors that we have to be aware of as we look at these things, because we benefit from freedom from. And what freedom from basically did, freedom from religion, is it basically said that every society needs some type of common bond. In other words, you would think that the freedom of religion says you all just do your own thing. You want to do this, you want to do that. Okay, it almost seems to be an extreme pluralistic society where we'll let every group do what they want. The problem is, if you do that, you don't have a cohesive interaction, and not only that, you have to have some type of interaction between the groups where there is some overall societal perspective. So there's a certain point where society has to come up with some policy across the board to all its citizens. The key about freedom from is that the only influence in the developing of that societal concept should be rational, natural morality. In other words, you have to have a discussion in this regard over rational ideas. So, and this affects issues in terms of, let's say, gay rights and so forth, in the sense that if you're going to come in and say the Bible says that homosexuality is prohibited, that has no standing in a freedom from religion environment. Because because religion basically are arguments for ethics based upon revelation. The religion says to do this. Okay? So if you walk in and say, this is my religion, in a freedom from essence, which is a voice in the development of a societal ethic or a societal concept, you give your arguments, but the fact that your religion believes in it should not be a factor. That's freedom from. And that was in response to the church and so forth, in the sense that the church would have a major influence in France. The classic example of freedom from is France, where the church would say, this is wrong, that's wrong, this is wrong. No, wait a second. We're not interested in what you think is wrong. You convince me that it's wrong. Don't tell me it's that the religion says it's wrong. If you have an argument, fine. If not, then we don't want to hear from it. Okay, as in the development of the general societal principles. Okay, that's one side of the freedom from. Therefore, in terms of Jews, what we have to recognize is the fact that you happen to believe in something, and the gay rights issue is perhaps an example of it. You have to be careful that if your only argument is because the Torah says that it's usher, well, I have to recognize that if that's my argument, and I'm going to go out there and argue that my religion believes in this, and therefore I want it to be a principle in the society, then someone else is going to say that their religion believes in something else. You have to be careful about that. So that's a freedom from consideration, and that basically means that we should not impose our religion in the general society. Okay, so the question that exists in that regard is, do we have any responsibility to impose? And we talk about religion, we talk about Shem Mrs. B'nai Noach and so forth and so forth. Do we have any argument or obligation to impose Torah concepts, including the Shem Mrs. B'nai Noach, on society? Okay, and in that regard, if we do, then we are going to run into a problem with freedom from. And the question is, even if we do, considering that we benefit from other people not imposing on us, that becomes a practical issue in terms of that discussion, in terms of that interchange. That maybe we say, listen, we really would like this to be the halacha for everyone. However, if we do it, they're gonna come back our way. And the classic example of that is the Jewish viewpoint in terms of abortion. Okay, now there's an interesting article that Rabbi Broid, it's actually Rabbi Broid's article, that he wrote on Jewish law and American public policy. And one copy and a second copy. And he basically deals, to a large extent, with, as a fundamental beginning issue, is the Jewish obligation to promote the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach in a second. Do we have an obligation? And he argues, and he actually develops this in another article of his. It's very clear the Rambam seems to imply there is a halakha obligation on Jews to promote Noachide observance among non-Jews. The Rambam seems to be very adamant about that. But the fact is, as Rabbi Broid argues, that the other Rishonim do not agree. That most other Rishonim don't agree. And he argues that we don't have a halachic obligation to promote Noachide observance by non-Jews. Okay, he does argue in that article, and by the way, the article, I should mention the name of the article for people watching it, is called Jewish Law and American Public Policy, a Principal Jewish Law View and Some Practical Jewish Observations, and it is available online. So if someone watching this video wants to, you can Google Michael Broyd or whatever, or Jewish Law and American Public Policy, and I'm sure this article will come up. Okay. The fact is that he does argue in the article that we may have some moral obligations to do that. And the truth is, if you think about what the defining characteristic of Avraham Avinu was, Avraham Avinu basically tried to promote observance of Torah, observance of monotheism by the world. That was the real distinction of Avraham. Most people point to the fact, most people say Avraham was the first monotheist. It's not true that he was the first monotheist. There were obviously monotheists before. Noah was a monotheist. Noah's sons, Shem was a monotheist. There was Yeshiva Shem V'Aver. There were people around who believed in one God. The thing was, Avraham was the first to discover the one God, so he really was the first Baal Tshuva. That would seem to be the one characteristic of Avraham. However, the fact is that the other thing that Avraham is noted for, which is perhaps more dominant in terms of his definition as the founder of Klal Yisrael, was not just the fact that he founded God, is that he promoted the belief in God. So there's so many midrashim to that effect. The fact that he was Machnas Orach, he can guess and talked about one God and so forth and so forth. So therefore, and Rabbi not referring to Avraham Avinu, but the fact is he refers to the fact that there is a concept in Judaism, even though there's not a halakhic obligation of trying to spread godly thought, Torah thought in the world. Okay, but not being a halakhic obligation, it becomes much more of a policy issue. And that's basically what he wants to say. But the fact is, in a world that is concerned about freedom from religion, okay, there is an important concept that we have to recognize, that if we argue from our religious perspective, then we're giving ammunition to others who will try and promote their religious perspective.
So the Jews who run ACLU are actually not the bad guys from a Jewish point of view.
Well, in what way?
That they go after anybody who will try to cross the boundaries between church and state.
Yeah. I mean, the fact is that the argument in many ways of the classic Jewish response, the ACLU, and like many Jews in the States are so concerned about church and state that Jews are almost like, one of the issues, for example, is school vouchers and support of day school education and so forth. And Jews are in the forefront of not having any support for day schools, because there's a concern of separation of church and state. For that reason, pardon?
You impose it through.
Right. I mean, that was an issue here in Ontario also, when they were talking about funding the Jewish schools. Not too many people mention this, but the fact is that the model, like the argument was, I mean, one of the strengths of that happened in Ontario for funding of schools. Okay, give a little background. Every other province in Canada, except for Ontario, the Jewish schools get public funding. Okay, Ontario doesn't. A person took Ontario to the UN, to the UN, and said you're discriminatory. The reason they were discriminatory, it's okay in the States. You have a school, it's secular. You want to do a religious school, do it on your own. But there wasn't discrimination. It was that this is what we offer for everyone, for free. In Ontario, though, you offer religious schools to the Catholics. There's a Catholic school system. That's discriminatory. That's saying this religion is to be treated different than other religions. Catholics get free education in Catholic schools. Jews don't. So that was the pressure. The people won in the UN human rights, and the pressure developed in Ontario to develop funding for Jewish schools. What a concern was of some people was, does that mean that Jewish schools will have to adopt the Catholic model? Because let's look at the Catholic model. The Catholic model has a Catholic school board elected by individuals, right? And if you speak to people, I for a while, a few years ago, and it was a few years in a row, there was a Catholic school out in Mississauga who used to bring me once or twice a year to speak about Judaism. There was a teacher there who was a philosopher, a philosophy teacher, and she brought me in as a rabbi to speak about Judaism. It was a very interesting discussion, because these kids know nothing, really didn't know anything about Judaism, and as I expressed things to them, they really opened up eyes, about the understanding of things. And she was telling me she was actually a very devout Catholic, and she was discussing the difficulties in being a devout Catholic in the Catholic school system, because a lot of people making the decision are not devoted Catholics, because it's voted by the school board. So it's a problem. Now, this really reached and this type of issue came up, and this was part of the problem. She said that there was no real discipline, like, of the religion in the school, because the school really wasn't run by the church. It was run by the school board. So it was a tension that way. And some people mentioned that even in Ontario with the Jewish school system. Would that mean that eventually, if we get funding, there would have to be a Jewish school board, the same as a Catholic school board? Well, first of all, what do you do with all the different viewpoints of schools, right? Okay, Leo Beck and Yosodei Torah would both be under the same school board, well, be a problem. And what makes you define it? So every Jew now gets to vote for a member of for the Jewish school board trustees. Well, it's no longer halachic area. If you say every Jew is going to vote, for sure that school board is not going to be halachic school board. That was some of the problem in developing it, in terms of how you deal with that issue. So you're right. In the States, Jews have always been adamant about separation of church and state, and adamantly so. But it also was a reason. But it's very interesting. It's also an aspect of the American psyche, in the sense that I remember, like here, I come from Ottawa, and then I live in Toronto and so forth, and the majority of people that I knew sent their kids to day school. Okay, I think it was pretty standard that you send your kids to day school. Even if you're in any way a committed Jew, it was pretty standard that most what you would find is committed Jews. I'm not talking about Fromm or whatever, but most Jews, day school for some time. Grade 4, grade 6, grade 8, whatever. That was it. And you have it in Toronto in terms of Associated and USDS and so on and so forth. We were talking to an American, and this was a committed woman, and she didn't send her kids to day school, and I was shocked. Okay, she was pretty traditional and committed, and she was adamant about how wrong it was to have day schools in America. You have to be part of the society and so forth. So it's a very different culture. But clearly, there is a great fear of the influence of church of making decisions based upon revelational arguments. That's why the argument, for example, in terms of creationism versus evolution. Why can't you just teach creationism in the school with evolution? So here's one theory of where everything came from. Here's another theory. Why can't you do that? Because one theory is scientific. The other theory, doesn't come from the scientists. Oh, there are scientists that support it, yes, but not because of pure science. And that's why they moved away from creationism to intelligent design. Because intelligent design became an argument that was trying to be a rational argument, that looking at the world. But the truth is, though, to be honest with you, and this was an article that Rabbi Shalom Karmi, who's the editor of Tradition, pointed out. He makes an interesting article that he actually wrote about this in one of the what was the name of in the Torah Model Journal, that there's also the secular bias. He says one of the difficulties in the university is the fact that there also is already a secular bias. In other words, the university does not want to accept the possibility of a supernatural explanation. So, and perhaps the best example I can think of it is I was once talking to someone about the arguments for Torah Sinai, the arguments for the Exodus, and so forth and so on. A lot of historical issues. There's nothing here. There's not, there's nothing in Egyptian history about this, and so on and so forth about this. And we're talking about this, and all the arguments that are presented for Torah Sinai, the 600,000, so forth and so forth. And he basically, this guy was talking, was very much in biblical criticism. He basically said, he gave me the weaknesses with all the arguments. And they were really strong weaknesses. He showed there's this problem, there's that problem, there's this problem, people don't understand. This is the argument, okay. So they're nice little arguments when you're getting someone, come in, what do you do with this question? Well, it's a good question, but the point is, if you really know the issues, you understand the argument is not so. Then he paused for a second, he says, but there is one argument that I can tell you no one has been able to solve. He says, and what's interesting about this argument, he says, and none of the Kiruv organizations even know this argument, because you have to know the secular world to know this argument. And what he said was, says, there is a tremendous issue in history. It's clear cut from history, from archaeology and so forth, that a Jewish nation came into Canaan and conquered Canaan. And Canaan consisted of strong fortress cities. There's no doubt about that. And after that, we have a lot of archaeology supporting the fact that the Jews were there, and so forth and so forth. They conquered, and so forth and so forth. Until the Jews are found conquering Canaan, there is no archaeological evidence of a Jewish nation outside of Canaan. So one of the great questions of history is, how did this nation, which we have no archaeological evidence of where they were beforehand, how did this nation come and were strong enough to conquer the fortress cities of Canaan? There should be some place, we know that these nations who archaeological days were found here, and they build up here, and then for some reason they decided to conquer Canaan. The Hebrews show out of nowhere, strong enough to conquer Canaan. It says ancient history does not have, the ancient historians do not have an explanation for that. He says, and the truth is, the only explanation that's on the books is the Torah explanation. That the nation really, 40 years is a blink of an eye in history. And not only that, the 40 years when they were in the desert, all the archaeological things that you would expect to find from a country, from a nation, were not there. Because most of archaeology is cooking and bathroom. That's a lot of archaeology. And Klal Yisrael, when they were in the desert, right? What cooking? Well, maybe a little bit of this, but the fact of it is they were on man. They had water that went with them, and they didn't go to the bathroom. So the fact is, and that's just so the truth is that this nation was 40 years, came out of nowhere, out of Egypt, where it wasn't about. All of a sudden, it's out of nowhere. The only explanation is this revelational, supernatural explanation that this nation was created, and all of a sudden they're strong enough to take over Canaan. So he says that's it. But the fact is that secularist bias means that in the university you can't even put that on the table.
But when they were in Egypt, they were separated.
So it seems that they were in Goshen, They were in Goshen. So the point is we might they might have some archaeological digs, but they weren't a separate nation. In other words, they weren't really a separate nation. And from what I understand, like I'm basically relying upon what he said, but they weren't really. You don't have the real issue is in Goshen. Maybe there's some indications of slaves being there and so forth and so forth. But he was saying what's really missing is the fact that there's no indication of a strong nation that would be able to conquer Canaan in terms of being somewhere as a strong nation. In Egypt, they're so subjugated.
If you look at the other cultures, other little bits of Eastern people,
Yeah.
the Incas, for example,
Right.
they were a minor tribe around Cusco, very minor.
Yeah.
But in 1230, they decided, okay, we had enough.
Right.
And they started conquering and built this within 200 years, 300 years.
Right.
They built an incredible empire.
Right, but you can see the development. You can see the development, and they already were, even if they were only in a small place, they already had a foothold. The problem is that it seems from what this guy told me is that there's no explanation where this nation came from to be able to conquer. In other words, we know that they conquered, but we don't know where they came from. It's like the Incas; they came from place A, where they were small, whatever, and they built themselves out to be stronger. But the timeline. The truth is this is not something I'm really, up on. Like I'm not really a student of ancient history, but what I'm just saying is the reflection of the secular bias that does exist in the world. Okay, and this is something where Rabbi Carmen doesn't really mention this example, but he talks about the fact is that in the university there's a secular bias that any argument that is defended by a religious argument, i.e. a supernatural idea that comes from God, will not be accepted as an argument within a university context. So the point is there is that bias. But the fact is that's an outgrowth of freedom from religion. And we Jews have to respect that. And the issue which Rabbi Boyd is dealing with is that issue is, do we have an obligation to push our religion? If we don't, then from a policy viewpoint, we can allow for freedom from religion to sort of to sort of protect us, because we won't have the society developing religious concepts that will impose upon us. Okay, which is really what separation of church and state is from. Okay, so the truth is that in a certain way, I guess it gets into prayer in the school, whatever it is, in the sense that in a certain way we want to be careful about another religion imposing upon us. So to do that, we have to recognize that we have to accept a place of not imposing upon them. Okay, so that's one issue. The second issue is of freedom of religion. And freedom of religion is allowing me to do my thing, which also came up in the prayer aspect, where some schools, from what I understand, now allows kids to have a moment of contemplation. In other words, we're going to give every child a moment, a quiet moment, where they can do whatever prayer that they want in their perspective. And this is a balance that exists between freedom from religion and freedom of religion. Freedom of religion basically says you should be allowed to do whatever you do. Okay? Freedom from religion basically says whatever you do, right, should not impose upon the societal standard. And this is tensions that exist between them. Okay, now a good example of that tension is Obamacare. That really is a good example of that tension, in the sense that the society wishes to have, i.e. the Obamacare as a reflection of a societal policy is, it is a good idea in our society that we have health care for all members of the society. Okay, and health care defined in a certain broad manner, which, pursuant to Obamacare, includes some aspects of birth control. Okay. So, okay, fine. And that in part of Obamacare is the employer is allowed has to pay for this care. Okay. Which will mean that the employer will pay for the employee to do something which may be contrary to the religious beliefs of the employer. So the issue becomes freedom of versus freedom from. The employer is saying freedom of religion. I should not have to do something. No, the employer.
Isn't it freedom from?
No, freedom from. He's actually saying freedom of. I want to follow my religion. Therefore, what he's saying is that the law should not impose upon me to do something contrary to my religion. That's.
What about if you go with that culture, that American culture is a religion and they treat it as such?
Okay, but the development of that's a question of where the place of religion is in American culture, or that it's its own system, not based upon faith. It's okay. The point over there, freedom from, is the employee's argument. The employee is basically saying is our society has developed a standard, okay, of healthcare to include this practice, basic issue being one of birth control, and that the religious beliefs of that other person should not impose upon my religious, and it's a question, and that's really the attention. In other words, what I was saying is for the employer is saying I should be allowed to practice my religion. My religion says, the Catholic Church was a classic example of this. My religion says I should not participate in birth control, and I should be allowed to practice my religion. Freedom of. The employee is saying, listen, our society is developing a standard. That standard is being argued out, so forth and so forth. We've come to a conclusion that there should be a national health program. And that national health program, separation of church and state, should not have influences from another religion. Therefore, freedom from religion, I should not have my rights to get birth control through this national health system be compromised because of someone else's religious beliefs. And it's that tension of freedom of and freedom from. Now, the point is, though, is that from a Jewish perspective, we support freedom of. Freedom of supports a pluralistic idea. It basically says, because there's a tension in the developing of the societal standard. Okay, freedom from basically says the society makes a standard and religion shouldn't have an influence of it. Freedom of says the societal standard should be as pluralistic, as broad as possible, to allow to a certain extent all religions to be comfortable within that standard. So the Jewish world has constantly argued for freedom of. Okay? And that's been our major thing. We've also supported the concept of freedom from. Freedom from works because we say we can get by with not imposing our will upon others. So this came up with the abortion issue. Okay? In the abortion issue, you had Rabbi Freud refers to it with the decision on time of death, where basically the same idea that the law should be that an individual can make a decision based upon in concert with his religious advisor. Okay, the result of it, and this is why abortion becomes an interesting example, is the abortion example is that abortion is usher for B'nai Noach. Okay, the standard for abortion the law for abortion is much stricter for B'nai Noach than for a Jew. Okay, if you allow what do you call it? Roe versus Wade, allow for abortion on demand, it's totally the right of the mother, then there will be abortions that take place that are contrary to Noachide law and contrary to halachic law. Okay, but the first concern being Noachide law. Do we have any obligation to go in and say we should try and get America to apply Noachide law on abortion? Okay, so that's the first argument, that no, we don't have any obligation to do that. And not only that, we would not like to do that because we like America to have a concept of freedom from. Okay? So therefore we will not push our religion, and this way we don't want anyone else pushing their religion. Okay. What we will request also in a freedom of side is that we're also not too happy, and this is where it came into the issue, should you support any pro-life things? So Moshe's argument was that we should actually be pro-choice. It's not only should we not impose our religious perspective, but we should actually take the other perspective of saying everyone can do what they want, because there are certain positions in the pro-life camp that would forbid an abortion when it is halachically mandated. Okay, a woman, until the head or most of the fetus has emerged from the mother. Okay, you are to kill the fetus to save the mother. It's not even the mother's choice. That's the halacha. So therefore, if a woman is already in labor, right? There are people who say that whatever it is that there's some segments of pro-life would say this is a situation where you can't kill the mother, you can't kill the fetus to save the mother, where halachically it would be mandated. Therefore, therefore, we want to argue to the extent possible of freedom of religion and let everyone make their own decision. Okay? So, but the thing that happened with Obamacare, the interesting thing about Obamacare is so the abortion issue, freedom from, hey, we're not going to oppose our way. Freedom of, we're going to argue for extensive possible and so forth. What happened with Obamacare is the two sides of the coin. Okay? In the sense that the Catholic Church was arguing freedom of. And they were saying we should be allowed to practice our religion. Our religion says we don't pay for birth control. Okay? On the other hand, the employees were arguing freedom from. Right? The national policy should not consider religious involvement. Now, the fact is, though, is that that's a certain amount of a tension. The truth is, though, is that the RCA, the Biblical Council of America, came out to some extent in support of the Catholic position, and that's because, in a certain way, freedom of was very much on their mind. Okay, because the freedom from argument was not as I don't think it was clearly presented. So here's a press release of the RCA. Mark, keep going. Okay, that you can get off their website also. It's rabbis.org, where they had a press release put on me. And the press release basically says, whereas Americans, we must never compromise freedom of religion for all of our citizens, and whereas the Rabbinical Council of America stands united with Americans of all faiths in supporting freedom of religion, and whereas in January of 2012 a new Department of Health and Human Services regulation under the Affordable Care Act mandated certain minimum health insurance coverage requirements that most employers must provide to their employees, and whereas many religious groups are concerned with these requirements, will require some employers employers that violate the injunctions of their religion. Therefore, the Rabbinical Council of America commends the Catholic Church and other religious organizations for raising issues of concern on this matter, and commends the President and administration for considering and responding to citizens' concerns with the said regulation, and urges the administration in consultation with relevant religious bodies to include further necessary protections to safeguard the religious rights of all Americans, which is a classic freedom of argument. Okay, the point is that what about freedom from? That's an argument from outside the world. We don't see a situation here where the defending the Catholic Church's freedom of will cause a problem in terms of freedom from. Okay. Okay. In other words, it's true that there's this idea that we benefit from freedom from, that religious aspects can be involved, but the fact is from the RCA's perspective, freedom of is something that we're going to protect further, and this is generally from our perspective, we want freedom of to trump. In this situation. Because
if we were an employee.
Well, that's the whole point. Because the fact is the argument that's coming from the employees is other rights. They're arguing freedom from, in order to say religion should not be imposed upon us, and we're not dealing with that because we're arguing for freedom of. We're saying that the Catholic Church's right to practice their religion should triumph over the employee's right to health care, which was a societal value, which the employee will argue from freedom from, but we won't have to be overly concerned about that challenge to freedom from. Okay, because freedom of is what we try to prove more. Usually what we're concerned about freedom from is by us not imposing on others, we're sort of supporting freedom from.
Well, what about if you work for a Catholic organization? If a Jew works for a Catholic organization, that then expects him to give Christmas presents.
Oh, but that's where you get an issue. See, the fact is that that's a good way of putting it. The fact is, though, is what you're dealing with, and the issue is that the way I framed that question, and what I really tried to, what I'm really saying is we've supported freedom from, in the sense that religion shouldn't have shouldn't have too much of a voice in termination of social policy, and we can get away with that because we don't have any halachic obligation to impose upon others. There is a little bit of a problem with it. I should say that, even though Rabbi BAYT deals with it from non-Jews and so forth and so forth. It's interesting because the abortion decisions, I know we're speaking to other people about this, it's interesting because the abortion decision also means Jews will violate Jewish law, right? But the argument of freedom from was, and the way we can get around that is that the real concern in that law, our obligation in terms of ensuring that Jews follow the law, would be in a general category of lifnei iver, okay? And lifnei iver is very technical. It's a very technical idea, and usually, and I believe it's very much of a policy argument. Lifnei iver, if you look at some achorim on lifnei iver, like for example, the classic question is, do you invite someone over on Shabbos who's going to drive over? So people, there's this halachic argument, so forth and so forth, but there seems to be an attitude within the poskim that if your reason for inviting them over is to introduce them to Shabbos, right? And it's true, they may not drive to the golf course then. They may stay home and not actually do any Chilul Shabbos, but the point is they won't have any experience of a Shabbos. Okay, so the reason you're inviting them over is not to cause averas, but actually to eventually have a long-term positive effect from a Jewish perspective. Then under lifnei iver would not be lifnei iver, because lifnei iver is not most halachic categories are technical. It's very technical down to the point. Lifnei Iver is much more policy oriented. And being a policy idea, it's almost like, well, what's your intent? Your intent is to increase eventual Jewish commitment. So therefore, you're not doing it to actually, as they say, stumbling block. You're not trying to create a stumbling block. You're trying to actually help the guy.
So if I could go to my nephew's bar mitzvah in a Reform shul on a Shabbos, so that I can introduce some orthodoxy there in a gentle kind of way.
Yeah, I'm not going to paskin on a specific issue, but I would say that in consideration, with let's say, I get questions, let's say in terms of an intermarriage or something of that nature, that an argument that says, listen, if I don't show up at all, it would break any connection with that person. I'll never be able to have any influence on that person in the future. If I do show up down the road, I will have some influence. Especially, let's say it's a woman who's marrying a non-Jewish man whose kids will be Jewish, and this way I will maintain a relationship with them, and so forth and so forth. Then, if you see it as a policy issue rather than a technical halachic issue, then there's much more policy concern. And that's really what was happening over here. That's the argument. So the point is, from a policy issue, you take in the long-term effect and so forth and so forth. The argument for freedom from works that way in the sense that we don't have to impose. We have no obligation to impose. Therefore, we can try and do what we can to make sure no one else, since we don't have to impose, we can take a stand of freedom from and not have anyone else imposing. Freedom of will encourage, because pluralism. The fact is, but in that regard, and that was the other case that's mentioned, Rabbi Roy mentioned, but I think I mentioned to you in terms of pagans wanting to do animal sacrifices. And for Orthodox organization, it was actually a case, I thought it was Maryland, it's actually a case in Florida. And Orthodox organizations intervene from the Orthodox intervened in the court, all on the side of the pagans because of freedom of. Even though you're basically letting pagans do avodah zarah, and there's nothing worse than avodah zarah. Okay, misa, something. But I mean, but the fact is freedom of is a policy consideration that we have to develop. So the point was, yeah.
I was just going to say, but here I'm reading being a light unto the nations. Even though we're not supposed to convert or influence, but we can lead by example.
Right. Right, but he also argues there's different considerations of how we as Jews should positively affect the world based upon our moral and ethical perspective. But he basically says it's not a halachic obligation, and therefore, what it means is these are considerations. So since they're good ideas that are.
Not a commandment, but not a commandment. Wasn't that what Hashem said? You're supposed to be a light unto the nations.
Now, actually, it's a statement in Navi. It's not really. It's really. I forget which Navi says it, but it's not in Tanakh. It's a statement of the Navi that says that you'll be a light unto nations, so forth and so forth. But it's not. That's his point. It's not a absolute halachic obligation. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, it's from Yosef. Right. So the fact is that you're supposed to influence Jews and Gentiles to get it together. But the fact is, it's not. There's a difference between a technical halachic obligation, and therefore, once it becomes a good policy, then the fact is you can consider it as a policy idea, and you trying to force it in such a way that will eventually backfire, because the other religion, which is stronger than you, is going to come back and push their point. In other words, even though we're against idolatry, and we're not happy about these pagans doing animal sacrifices and practicing paganism, it's better that we maintain our voice that allows us to practice Judaism than to start having some other force preventing us from practicing. And that's concerned. The place I want to end today is that these are issues, but the place I want to end today is I really led up to this case of freedom of and freedom from. And the case came up in Obamacare, where you had freedom of and freedom from, and the RCA came up very strongly in the freedom of, right? While the employees would have argued freedom from, but we should not let religion interfere with our general policy, our general secular policy, which usually works for us. But the RCA took a stand that said we're going to promote freedom of versus even though it would be a limitation of freedom from the employee's perspective, but we can live with that. The problem is, and this is what I want to deal with next week, is I think that same-sex marriages and the issue with how we relate to gay rights is going to be a place where freedom from really collides with freedom of, and that's the issue, because you have to understand that. I'll just end with this, and you can see this as the issue. But the red light's still on over here, right? Yeah, the red light's still on there, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that when the same-sex marriage argument came up and people said we're against same-sex marriages based upon religion, they were arguing freedom of. It's interesting, the response I saw from someone from CNN, he says, that's like the Southern Baptists who are arguing for slavery based upon freedom of. Because our religion says that blacks should be slaves. And that was freedom of. And the people who are arguing against gay rights based upon their religion are arguing freedom of. And that's why it becomes an interesting argument, because then do you immediately give in to all gay rights? Well, that's an interesting thing, but the fact is that that's where the issue, because they're arguing freedom from, but our position of freedom of will sort of say, listen, we have to have some allowance for us not to in the secular world. In other words, our freedom of means somewhat of a challenge to freedom from. Okay, and that's the big issue, and we're going to try and deal with homosexuality and same-sex marriages in the last class next week.
So